All right, so after that intro yesterday, I figured there's no better way to start off the channel than going right into the most controversial idea that I probably have on that entire list. So obviously, as you can tell by the title, this is the controversial big three barbell movements. And I want to say that I know this is controversial, and my goal here is to challenge the consensus on this a little bit. So before I get into this, I do want to say I'm not saying that these don't work. I'm saying that they're overrated and that we're blindly following them, and that is always bad. I also want to say that these aren't necessarily my three favorite movements or the three movements that I think are best for bodybuilding and hypertrophy. These are just my three favorite when it comes to barbell movements. I do have many more exercises that I think are much more effective that I personally prefer more, whether they're actually better or worse than these three. I don't want you guys to get the wrong idea when I give my ideas here. So the first thing I want to say here is that these lifts are the best in theory, the squat, bench, deadlift, for those of you that don't know what we're talking about here. So the squat, bench, deadlift, if you spent more than 20 minutes on any type of fitness channel or the internet for bodybuilding at all, you know squat, bench, deadlift is what everybody just kind of blindly says, and they hear it, goes in one ear, goes out their mouth, they repeat it to everybody that they see, and everybody follows this. It's very obvious. We all know this. So my counter argument to this is that these are taxing movements. They really are tiring, and they're going to wear your joints out over time. And for those of you that disagree with that, my challenge to you would be, have you actually trained these movements? Have you hit a high 400 squat? Have you hit a 500, 600 plus deadlift? Have you benched over 275 or 300? You'll realize that once you've gotten to those points, if you're training for hypertrophy, it is going to take a toll on you. And I'm going to explain that in a little bit here. So obviously, can you get to a 600 deadlift? Can you get to a 500 squat, 300 or 400 bench without taking much of a toll on your body? Kinda. It's possible. But if you're looking for bodybuilding, if you're looking to build muscle and for muscle hypertrophy, there's no way this is going to be effective for you while saving your body at the same time. I'll explain that in a minute. I know it's a little confusing. So the point that I've got here is, if your joints aren't worn out from these movements, you're not training hard enough for hypertrophy anyways. And when I say that, I don't mean you're not training hard. I get it. Doing a 1 rep max, 2 rep max, 5 rep max on these movements, that's tough. At the end of the day, that's not going to be enough volume to actually train for hypertrophy. So is it going to be difficult? Yeah. But if you want to get stronger, you can do those movements, go super heavy. Maybe you do a single at 90%, triple at 80, 85% with some of these. That's going to get you nowhere for hypertrophy. If you're doing multiple sets, let's say you're taking 3 sets of 6 on bench, squats, or deadlifts to just about failure, maybe RPE 8, 9, 9.5 or something for multiple sets within a workout, and you're doing that multiple times a week, that will probably get you a little bit bigger. I think we can all agree on that. But there's no way that's sustainable. And that's because you're going to get overuse. You're going to have to deload. There's a couple other points I have written down here. Let me find them. So you're not going to be in close proximity to failure if you're actually training these for volume long term. If you're doing 3 sets of 10 on squats, or let's say you're doing even like a set of 6, 8, 10, 12 on squats, if you're doing that regularly and you're getting stronger over time, you're either not training hard enough to actually build muscle, or you're going to burn yourself out. You're going to get injured. You're going to accumulate a ton of fatigue, and you either basically get stronger without getting bigger, or you start to get bigger and then you're forced to deload. You're forced to accumulate all this fatigue. There's all these things that you really want to avoid. And while these movements can be good for powerlifting, they really are not optimal for building muscle. So that's basically the point that I'm trying to get at here. So again, this is all in theory when people say that these movements are the best for building muscle, the best for bodybuilding. So what I want to say is, let's take that theory for a second. Let's dive into that. So you've got the squat that basically works your back really well. Obviously, the primary mover is going to be your quads. That's quite obvious if you've ever done a squat. And then obviously your glutes are going to do a lot. Your core is going to be activated. There's a lot of muscles that your squat works. Keep in mind, it does put a lot of loading onto your lower back. And then let's take the deadlift, for example. So keep in mind, this is all in theory. The deadlift works pretty much every muscle in your body. We'll start at the top. It works your traps, rhomboids, spinal erectors, lats, triceps, forearms, glutes, a little bit of quads, lots of hamstrings, a little bit of calves, essentially everything, besides like your chest and maybe a tiny bit of biceps. So yes, if you're trying to get bigger, you do want to work every muscle. That's one of the most important factors to getting bigger that a lot of people avoid. The problem with the deadlift is, what I like to say is, it's a jack of all trades and a master of none. And this applies to a lot of those big barbell compound movements that you hear people talk about all the time. That is basically kind of infecting bodybuilding, and has been for a few years now. So basically, the reason why I want to talk about this is because, yes, in theory, a deadlift works every muscle, you're going to get bigger. It just makes sense. The problem with this theory is that you need to have the fundamentals of hypertrophy down to actually get bigger. So if you want to get one of your muscles bigger, it needs to have adequate volume, it needs to be in a good proximity to failure, and you need to train it with enough frequency. And then exercise selection is important too. That one's a little bit of a different one. I'll talk about that later. But the one I want to focus on here, the biggest factor that a deadlift just completely misses for hypertrophy is the proximity to failure. So one of the best quotes to describe this lift, and not just this lift, but any big barbell compound movement, is you're only as strong as your weakest link. So think about it this way. If you're deadlifting, most people, the weakest muscle on a deadlift is typically glutes and hamstrings, maybe your spinal erectors, typically one of those. If your grip gives out, maybe just wear straps. It's never going to be like your lats aren't strong enough or something like that. At least not very common with that, that's for sure. So let's say your glutes and hamstrings are super weak, they need to get stronger. And you do deadlifts expecting every muscle to grow. The problem with that is, when your glutes and hamstrings give out on a deadlift and you can no longer get any more reps, you took that movement to failure. That, yes, probably worked your glutes and hamstrings a lot. However, you don't want to take deadlifts to failure. And even if you do, you're going to tire yourself out like crazy. You're going to be accumulating a ton of fatigue that's going to severely impact the rest of your training. And during that, the muscles that you also thought you were training, like your traps, like your lats, like your forearms, during that deadlift, basically made no progress, because your weakest link gave out first, and that's what's going to grow from that movement. So that's why you're not making any gains, is because if you're doing these minimalist programs and have this minimalist philosophy on training, it really isn't going to do that much for you for hypertrophy, because of the fatigue, one, but mostly because of that proximity to failure. It makes a lot of sense if you really think about it and actually apply it, like I did for years. And I kind of suffered because of it. And I just want to make sure nobody else goes down that. It's something that's totally avoidable, and I suffered a completely unnecessary amount of fatigue by doing these movements. These movements could have been totally avoided for years, but instead I completely burned myself out. These movements, if you're actually training them with the foundations of hypertrophy training, it's not possible to get bigger. Because let's say you do. Let's say you take 3 sets of squats, at least 6 or 8 reps. Let's say you're doing like 8 to 15 reps on squats, 3 sets with close proximity to failure. There's 2 outcomes on this. The first outcome is you're going to have to deload pretty frequently. And when I say that, I mean, at first, you're probably going to have to do it maybe every 4 weeks, 5 weeks. By the time you're squatting like at least 315, which doesn't take that long if you're training properly, you're going to have to deload like every 3 weeks. And even with that, you're still going to be accumulating fatigue by that second week anyways. So totally not worth it. So what I'm trying to say here is when you properly program these lifts, it's not real. You can't do it. The only way to properly program these lifts to where you progressively overload and get stronger over time is to train like a powerlifter, and that will not get you bigger. I promise. It will not get you bigger. At least not to where you want to be. You can get a little muscle, you can get a little size. Sure, don't quote me word for word on that, because I'm not saying you can't get bigger at all. What I'm trying to say is you're not going to get nearly optimal results doing that. I've been there. I've done that. I've tried that. So again, this is all theory. The reason why this started in the bodybuilding industry is it's actually pretty obvious, because it kind of started when I got into the industry in the first place and started lifting. You guys know the word Powerbuilding, right? So sounds great. You get the best of both worlds. You get bigger, you get stronger. And that's fine. I'm not necessarily against Powerbuilding. The problem I have with Powerbuilding is when it kind of gets mixed into bodybuilding. So you take all these guys that want to build muscle, that want to get bigger, that don't really care about their strength, and if they do, it's for an egotistical reason. And you have them try these power building programs that are just not optimal for hypertrophy. I mean, once your total gets high, and when I say total, for those of you that don't know, that's squat, bench, deadlift, 1 rep max combined. Good luck with that. I mean, I've been there before. I've had the 600s deadlift. I've had the upper fours, well, mid fours in the squats, about 455, and then I've had a low to mid 300 bench. I mean, the amount of weight you have to use when you're training for that is just ridiculous. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and act like I was like the strongest guy. I mean, I was pretty strong, but I'm nowhere close to these dudes deadlifting 800 plus, squatting in the 5s or 6s, benching 405. I was never that, but even for like a late intermediate, early advanced, like I had pretty good numbers, and that was tiring. I literally couldn't imagine if I had stuck with that and just kept that same belief. Like, would I be deadlifting 700 pounds, doing like 635 for a 5x5, thinking that's getting me bigger? Like, oh my God, it would just be ridiculous. So I'm very glad that I finally had that click in my head that this is not the right way to go. At least not once you get to like the midpoint of intermediate. Once you're past that, forget about it. There's much better things you could be doing to get bigger. Trust me. So another point that I have here is you have to keep in mind that you have to stabilize these movements much more. Obviously, it's a free weight. You're what's keeping that weight in its bar path. That's essentially what it does. It's your job. So with that being said, something I fell for when I was starting out training, and even pretty far into my like late intermediate phase, like when I was hitting all those big numbers, I swore by it. I was like, you need to stabilize. I was like, machines are useless. Cables probably don't do much because you're not stabilizing it. This is not the right way to think. It is super overrated for hypertrophy. And when I say that, I'm talking about stabilizing. It's important. Yes, you should have at least one free weight movement that you have to stabilize. Like, yeah, it doesn't hurt to have that, but to act like it's the end all be all and the only way to get bigger, or even that it's that much better than a machine or cables, is just ridiculous. Don't worry about the stabilization. Include it in your training properly, and I'll have videos on that in the future, but don't think that you need squat, bench, deadlift, big, crazy compound movements, lifting heavy, or just taking these to failure, or even close to failure, which is just not a smart idea. Don't think that's going to help you a whole ton. There are many better ways to go about that, and I will be explaining all of that in future videos. If you have any questions, leave a comment, and I'll be sure to answer it. I know this is a lot to take in all at once, so I'd be happy to make some more videos or go a little bit more in depth on some of this stuff, because I know it's new, I know it's confusing. So let's see. Here's what I want to finish up on. So with everything that I just said, to summarize all that, big free weight barbell compound movements are great in theory because they target a lot of muscles. In practice, they're not optimal because you can't take all of those muscles in that compound movement close enough to failure. Stabilization is also overrated for hypertrophy. That's basically a paraphrase of everything that I just went over. To take that and put something else into practice, I don't just want to leave you with that, is accessory movements should be a real priority. And keep in mind, accessory movement is not necessarily an isolation movement. A lot of people confuse that, especially when it comes to comparing compounds and isolations. I'll have more videos on this as well in the future, but accessory movements doesn't have to be like a bicep curl or like a calf raise or something. So accessory movements should be your main goal for hypertrophy. Let's see, a lat pull down, that's what I would call an accessory movement. That's probably one of the best hypertrophy exercises. Let's see, what's another one? Maybe a seated cable row, dips, like all this stuff. This is great for hypertrophy. This like little hack squat machine I have right here, excellent. I'd call that an accessory, sure. Awesome for hypertrophy, I promise you. So finally, to get to my final point, you can't train those great accessory movements optimally when you're tired from doing your squat, bench, and deadlift at the start of your workout, and with that accumulated fatigue that you've had for doing them for weeks on end. That is why I am kind of against these movements. Not entirely, but I think you get the point that I'm trying to make here. So, with that being said, take your accessory movement seriously. That is the bread and butter of your muscle building journey. Now, I promise, the final point here, my big 3 movements. I'm going to film a couple of these. I'll put them over the screen. I'll try and do a little bit of editing for you guys. So, the first one of my big 3 barbell movements is going to be a Romanian deadlift. And I know you might be thinking, didn't you just basically tear deadlifts apart? Yeah, I kind of did. So the reason why I like the RDL so much is because it's easily going to be the best way to work your hamstrings directly. Your spinal erectors aren't going to be worked a whole ton because you can't go too heavy. Yeah, you're going to have some extra muscles. This isn't a total isolation movement. It's actually kind of a compound movement. But basically, these RDLs or a stiff leg deadlift, whatever variation you prefer, they're pretty similar. This is going to be the best way to target your hamstrings. And those other muscles, you're not trying to target during this movement. You're not trying to target your back. You're not trying to target your forearms. You want to focus on your hamstrings and glutes with these. It's a great movement. It's awesome. And it is a master of training your glutes and hamstrings. It's not trying to be the jack of all trades and train every muscle like a deadlift. You can also use like less than half as much weight as you would on a normal deadlift, especially if you go a little slower, focus on that eccentric and be explosive on the way up. The next movement, this is going to be a little bit of a unique movement that I think is probably one of the most underrated for overall shoulder development. And this is going to be a seated overhead press, and not in the way that you just thought of it. The best way to do this is to be doing it without back support. So this way, you actually get to train your shoulders, not just your front delt. It trains your entire delt, and you still get to move in the right movement pattern because your torso does have to adjust to get around your head. That's why I hate the seated overhead press with the back support. They're very, very different exercises. The seat takes the stress off of your legs and off of your lower back a ton. Give this a try. It's an awesome movement. It might feel a little awkward at first, but it is great, and I promise you that. The last barbell movement of my big 3 is going to be barbell curls. So, am I saying that these are easily the best 3 barbell movements for building muscle? Not necessarily, but to stick to my values and stick to what's worked for me in the past and what I currently do, yeah, I mean, an inexperienced and beginner thing to say would be the squat, bench, deadlift are the 3 best barbell movements for hypertrophy because they target the most muscles. I already overcame that argument. Now, I'm going to argue what works. RDLs, seated OHP, and barbell curls. The reason why I say that is because they're sustainable exercises that I use regularly in my workouts. And I'm not going to, if I'm not doing something, why would I say it's the best? There's clearly something preventing me from doing that exercise that makes it not optimal. So those are the 3 best. It's been a long video, so I'm going to leave it at that. If you have any questions, which I hope everybody has questions because this is a kind of a crazy controversial video, leave a comment. I'm happy to kind of go back and forth or debate anybody on this. And when I make these videos, I'm not trying to say that I'm the end all be all or that I'm necessarily even right. I just want to spark some conversations. And if I end up being wrong and other people have different experiences or different opinions than me, I want to find what's right. I don't want to make myself right necessarily. I'm not here to prove myself or to be right. I'm here to challenge a little bit. And if that means that maybe I say something that isn't right, other people can debunk my argument pretty easily, and I can't think of anything that can debunk their argument, like, that's fine. We're trying to find out what's right. We're not trying to make myself right. So that's kind of the purpose of the channel. Those are my thoughts on everything. Like I said, leave a comment down below. I'd be happy to discuss this with anybody because, like I said, I'm not about being right. I'm about finding the truth, and I'm about helping people and basically making sure people don't go down a path that isn't necessarily optimal. So with that being said, that's pretty much all I got for today.